The silence in the armory was broken only by the methodical click of metal on metal. Staff Sergeant Kieran "Ghost" Mal worked alone in the pre-dawn darkness, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision across the M2010 enhanced sniper rifle. Each component gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as she dismantled, cleaned, and reassembled the weapon that had become an extension of herself over 3 tours in Afghanistan. The bolt slid home with a satisfying snap, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before reaching for the logbook. The leather-bound record lay open beside her, pages yellowed from desert sand and mountain humidity. Her entries filled the columns in neat, precise handwriting: date, location, range, conditions, outcome. The numbers told a story that few would ever fully comprehend. 2,940 meters. Her longest confirmed kill, achieved on a ridgeline outside Kandahar when the morning mist had lifted just enough to reveal a Taliban commander directing mortar fire onto a Marine patrol below. She traced the entry with her finger, remembering the weight of the decision, the steadiness required, the way the world had narrowed to nothing but crosshairs and breath control. The shot had taken 4 seconds to reach its target across that impossible distance, 4 seconds during which American lives hung in the balance. When the radio crackled with confirmation, target neutralized, Marines moving to safety, she had felt no satisfaction, only the hollow recognition of another name added to her ledger. The armory door creaked open behind her. Kieran didn't turn around immediately, recognizing the careful footsteps of someone trained to move quietly but choosing not to. Navy SEALs had a particular way of walking, even when they weren't trying to be stealthy, purposeful, measured, aware of every sound they made and every shadow they cast. Sergeant Mal. The voice carried the slight rasp of someone who had breathed too much cordite and sand. Mind if I take a look at that logbook? She finally turned, taking in the lean figure of Lieutenant Commander Marcus "Reaper" Castellanos. His reputation preceded him: Delta Force Transfer, 3 silver stars, more classified operations than most operators saw in their entire careers. What surprised her wasn't his presence, but the genuine curiosity in his dark eyes as he nodded toward her record book. "Permission to speak freely, sir." Kieran's voice carried the slight accent of rural Montana, softened but not erased by years of military discipline. "Always, Sergeant. Most people who ask to see that book are looking for bragging rights or trying to catch me in a lie. Which one are you?" Castellanos smiled, the expression transforming his angular features. "Neither. I'm looking for the best long-range shooter on this base, and your name keeps coming up in conversations." Kieran Mal had grown accustomed to skepticism. At 5 feet 4 inches, with auburn hair typically pulled back in a regulation bun and freckles that made her look younger than her 28 years, she didn't fit most people's image of a sniper. The special operations community remained largely male-dominated, and she had learned to let her marksmanship speak louder than her words. She slid the logbook across the metal table, watching Castellanos' expression as he opened it to the first page. His eyebrows rose slightly as he scanned the entries, his finger pausing on particular ranges and conditions that would challenge even veteran marksmen. When he reached the entry for 2,940 meters, he looked up with something approaching awe. This is real. He wasn't questioning her honesty, she realized, but rather grappling with the mathematics of such a shot. 2.9 kilometers, in mountain conditions. Variable wind, 40-degree slope, target moving laterally at approximately 3 meters per second. Kieran's voice remained steady, professional. Barrett M2010A1, match-grade ammunition, temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit, relative humidity 68%. Took me 6 minutes to calculate the shot, 4 seconds for the bullet to reach target. Castellanos closed the book carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. "Sergeant, how would you feel about a change of scenery? I'm putting together a team for a classified operation. Long-range interdiction, high-value targets, challenging terrain. the kind of work that requires someone who can make impossible shots in impossible conditions. Kieran studied his face, searching for signs of the usual patronizing attitude she'd encountered from special operations officers who viewed regular army personnel as second-tier assets. She found none. Castellanos was offering her something she'd dreamed of since enlisting, a chance to operate at the highest levels, to use her skills in service of missions that could change the course of conflicts. What's the target profile, sir? Enemy leadership embedded in civilian areas, maximum standoff distance required. Urban environment but with mountain approaches. Think Mogadishu meets Hindu Kush. He paused, letting the implications sink in. This isn't a regular deployment, Sergeant. This is off the books, compartmentalized, need-to-know basis. Once you're in, there's no backing out until the mission is complete. Kieran nodded slowly. She had been waiting for this moment without realizing it, the chance to move beyond routine deployments and conventional warfare. Her skills had been honed in Afghanistan's unforgiving terrain, tested against enemies who knew every ridge and valley. But this sounded different, more complex, more demanding, more consequential. The morning light was beginning to filter through the armory's small windows, casting long shadows across the room. In a few hours, the base would come alive with the routine bustle of training exercises and administrative duties. But this conversation was happening in the quiet space between night and day, in the realm where special operations lived and breathed. When do we leave, sir? The corners of Castellanos' mouth curved upward. Pack your gear, Sergeant. We fly out in 6 hours. And Ghost, he used her call sign for the first time, the nickname earned during her first deployment when she had remained invisible in a hide site for 72 hours before taking a shot that eliminated an entire Taliban command structure. Welcome to Task Force Phantom. As Kieran began gathering her equipment, she felt the familiar weight of anticipation settling in her chest. Every sniper lived for the perfect shot, the moment when skill, preparation, and opportunity aligned to create something approaching art. She had a feeling that wherever Task Force Phantom was headed, she would have the chance to discover just how perfect that shot could be. The C-130 Hercules sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprop engines gleaming in the afternoon sun. Kieran approached the aircraft with her gear bag slung over one shoulder and her rifle case secured in her other hand. The familiar weight of her equipment provided comfort in the face of uncertainty. Every piece had been selected, modified, and tested to meet her exacting standards. The crew chief, a grizzled Air Force sergeant with 20 years of lines etched into his face, nodded as she approached. "You the shooter?" His question carried no judgment, only professional curiosity. Word traveled fast in the special operations community, and a sniper with her record would be discussed in the ready rooms and maintenance bays where the real work of military aviation happened. "Depends who's asking," Kieran replied, setting her gear down carefully. She had learned to be cautious about her reputation. In the right circumstances, it opened doors and earned respect. In the wrong ones, it painted targets on her back and created expectations that could be impossible to meet. Staff Sergeant Chen, crew chief on this bird. He extended a calloused hand. "Been flying special ops for 12 years, seen a lot of shooters come and go. Most of them talk too much and shoot too little. Heard you're different." They shook hands, and Kieran appreciated the firmness of his grip. Military aviation crews were their own breed, professional and competent in ways that often went unrecognized. They flew into hostile territory, delivered operators to remote locations, and extracted them under fire without seeking glory or recognition. "What's our destination, Sergeant?" Chen glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Need to know, ma'am, but I can tell you we're making 2 fuel stops before we reach the operational area. Pack something to read. It's going to be a long flight." The interior of the C-130 had been configured for personnel transport, with red webbing seats along both sides and cargo netting securing equipment pallets in the center. Kieran found a seat near the front, stowing her gear according to the safety briefing that Chen delivered with practiced efficiency. The other members of Task Force Phantom were already aboard, and she took the opportunity to study her new teammates without appearing obvious. Lieutenant Commander Castellano sat across from her, reviewing what appeared to be intelligence briefings on a ruggedized tablet. His focus was absolute, the kind of concentration that suggested years of experience processing complex information under pressure. Beside him, a massive figure in army fatigues dozed with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to rest whenever opportunity presented itself. That would be Master Sergeant James Boulder, Washington, the team's demolitions expert and close-quarters battle specialist. His reputation for creative applications of high explosives was matched only by his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. At 6 feet 6 inches, and built like the linebacker he had been in college, he presented an imposing physical presence that could be either reassuring or intimidating depending on which side of the conflict you occupied. The fourth member of their team sat alone near the rear of the aircraft, methodically cleaning and checking electronic equipment. Captain Elena Cipher Vasquez was their intelligence and communications specialist, fluent in 6 languages, and capable of penetrating enemy networks with the same precision that Kieran applied to long-range shooting. Her small stature and quiet demeanor concealed a mind that could process information, identify patterns, and predict enemy behavior with uncanny accuracy. As the C-130's engine spooled up, filling the cargo compartment with their distinctive whine, Kieran felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied the beginning of a mission. Every operation was a puzzle to be solved, a series of variables to be calculated and controlled. But this felt different, more complex, more significant, more personal in ways she couldn't yet articulate. The aircraft lifted off with the subtle vibration that characterized military transport planes, and Kieran watched the base shrink below them through one of the small windows. Within minutes, they were over open ocean, heading toward a destination that remained classified even from the team members who would execute the mission. She settled back in her seat, closed her eyes, and began the mental preparations that every sniper learned to master. Visualization was critical. She would mentally rehearse every aspect of the mission once the briefing was complete, running through scenarios and contingencies until her responses became automatic. The perfect shot wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about reading terrain, understanding weather, predicting enemy movement, and maintaining psychological composure under extreme stress. Hours passed in relative quiet, broken only by the drone of engines and the occasional comment from the crew. Kieran dozed fitfully, her sleep punctuated by dreams of mountain ridges and impossible distances. When she woke, the light filtering through the windows had changed, suggesting they had crossed several time zones during her rest. "First fuel stop in 30 minutes, Chen announced over the intercom. "Stretch your legs, grab some chow, use the facilities. We'll be on the ground for an hour, then back in the air for the long haul." The airfield where they landed was clearly military but bore no identifying markings that Kieran could recognize. The architecture suggested somewhere in the Mediterranean region, possibly Italy or Greece, but the lack of visible flags or unit insignia reinforced the classified nature of their mission. This was the world where special operations lived, a realm of unmarked aircraft, anonymous bases, and missions that would never appear in official records. During their brief stop, Castellanos gathered the team in a secure briefing room adjacent to the flight line. The walls were lined with maps of regions Kieran didn't immediately recognize, marked with symbols and notations that suggested extensive intelligence preparation. A large display screen showed satellite imagery of what appeared to be an urban area nestled between mountain ranges, the kind of terrain that presented both opportunities and challenges for long-range engagement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Operation Ghostwatch." Castellanos' voice carried the authority of someone who had briefed dozens of similar missions. "Our target is a high-value individual operating in the Balkans, specifically in the mountains above Sarajevo. Intelligence indicates he's coordinating arms shipments to terrorist cells throughout Eastern Europe, using his position as a legitimate businessman to mask extensive criminal activities. The screen changed to show a photograph of their target, a middle-aged man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, the kind of person who could blend into any business meeting or social gathering. But Kieran had learned to look beyond surface appearances, to study the subtle details that revealed character and capability. This man's posture suggested confidence bordering on arrogance, the bearing of someone who believed himself untouchable. The challenge, Castellanos continued, is that he rarely leaves his compound, and when he does, it's with extensive security. Local law enforcement is compromised, and conventional approaches would result in significant collateral damage. That's where Ghost comes in. He nodded toward Kieran, using her call sign with the casual familiarity of someone who understood the importance of operational identity. Kieran studied the satellite imagery with professional interest. The target's compound sat on a hillside overlooking Sarajevo, with clear sight lines extending in multiple directions. But the distances involved would challenge even her capabilities, and the urban environment below meant that any miss could have catastrophic consequences. "What's the range?" she asked, already calculating angles and trajectories in her mind. Minimum engagement distance is 1,800 meters, maximum is just over 2,000. Variable weather conditions, mountainous terrain, civilian population density that requires absolute precision. Castellanos met her eyes directly. This isn't just about making the shot, Ghost. This is about making the shot perfectly, under conditions that would challenge any marksman alive. The weight of the mission settled on Kieran's shoulders like a familiar burden. Every sniper carried the responsibility for their actions, but this operation would have implications far beyond the elimination of a single target. Success would disrupt a network that threatened innocent lives throughout Europe. Failure could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and potentially endanger civilian populations. She nodded slowly, accepting the challenge with the quiet confidence that had characterized her entire career. "I'll need detailed meteorological data, wind patterns for the target area, and intelligence on the target's routine. When does he typically expose himself to long-range engagement?" "That's what we're going to find out," Castellanos replied. "This mission is about patience, preparation, and precision. We're going to establish overwatch positions, study his patterns, and wait for the perfect opportunity. There's no time limit, no political pressure for quick results. We take the shot when conditions are optimal, not a moment before." As they returned to the aircraft for the final leg of their journey, Kieran felt the familiar transformation that occurred before every mission. The civilian world faded away, replaced by the focused intensity that allowed her to function at the highest levels of her profession. Every detail became significant, every variable required consideration, every decision could mean the difference between success and failure. The mountains of Bosnia-Herzegovina appeared below them as dawn broke over the Balkans, their peaks shrouded in mist that would burn off as the sun climbed higher. Kieran pressed her face to the window, studying the terrain with professional interest. Somewhere in those mountains, a target waited, unaware that Task Force Phantom was approaching with the patience and precision that characterized the finest military operators in the world. The safe house sat in the hills above Pale, a modest structure that blended seamlessly with the surrounding countryside. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than a traditional Bosnian mountain home, complete with weathered stone walls and a red tile roof that had seen decades of harsh winters. But Kieran knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially in the world of special operations, where invisibility was often the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Captain Vasquez had established their communications center in the basement, her electronic equipment humming quietly as it intercepted and analyzed radio traffic throughout the region. Banks of monitors displayed real-time intelligence feeds, satellite imagery, and communication intercepts that painted a detailed picture of their target's activities. The basement had been converted into a high-tech nerve center that would have impressed even the most sophisticated intelligence agencies. Target designation is Falcon, Vasquez reported as the team gathered around her workstation. Real name Viktor Petrov, age 54, former Yugoslav army colonel turned arms dealer. Intelligence suggests he's responsible for weapons shipments to at least 6 terrorist organizations, with a network that extends from Belgrade to Berlin. Her fingers flew across multiple keyboards, bringing up photographs, financial records, and intercepted communications that told the story of a man who had built an empire on violence and chaos. Kieran studied the intelligence with professional detachment. Every target was someone's father, brother, or son, but allowing personal sentiment to interfere with mission execution was a luxury that snipers couldn't afford. Petrov had made choices that placed him in the crosshairs of international justice, and she was simply the instrument through which that justice would be delivered. "What's his security profile?" Kieran asked, scrolling through photographs of the target compound. "Minimum of 8 bodyguards at all times, all former military with small arms training," Castellanos replied. "The compound itself is hardened against conventional assault, reinforced walls, multiple escape routes, interlocking fields of fire. Local police are either bought or intimidated, so we can't count on any support from official channels." Master Sergeant Washington was examining the compound's defenses with the critical eye of someone who had breached similar installations on multiple continents. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, probably some nasty surprises for anyone who gets too close. This guy doesn't take chances. The satellite imagery showed a modern fortress disguised as a traditional mountain villa. The main building was surrounded by carefully landscaped grounds that provided excellent fields of fire for defending forces, while offering minimal cover for attackers. Outbuildings housed what appeared to be vehicle maintenance facilities and additional security personnel, creating a defensive perimeter that would challenge even well-equipped military units. "The good news," Vasquez continued, "is that Petrov maintains a predictable routine. Every morning at 0830 hours, he takes coffee on the main terrace overlooking the valley. Duration varies between 15 and 45 minutes, depending on weather and business requirements. He uses this time to conduct sensitive phone conversations, probably assuming that the distance from potential surveillance positions provides security." Kieran was already calculating sight lines and engagement angles. The terrace faced southeast, which meant morning sun would be at her back during the engagement window. That was advantageous for concealment, but could create thermal distortions that would affect long-range accuracy. She would need to position herself to minimize environmental variables while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid detection. "Show me potential firing positions," she requested, and Vasquez manipulated the satellite display to highlight elevated positions within engagement range of the target compound. 3 locations emerged as viable options. The first was a rocky outcropping approximately 1,900 meters to the northwest, offering excellent concealment and a clear line of sight to the target terrace. The second position sat atop a forested ridge 2,000 meters to the north, requiring a longer shot but providing multiple escape routes. The third option was the closest at 1,600 meters, located in the ruins of an abandoned village that had been destroyed during the Bosnian War. "I'll need to conduct reconnaissance of all 3 positions," Kieran decided. "Weather patterns, wind consistency, approach and egress routes, civilian activity in the area. This isn't the kind of shot you take based on satellite imagery alone." Castellanos nodded approvingly. "That's why you're here, Ghost. Boulder and I will establish overwatch positions while you conduct your reconnaissance. Cypher will monitor communications and track Petrov's routine. We'll spend as much time as necessary to ensure mission success." The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of careful observation and meticulous preparation. Kieran approached each potential firing position with the patience that had become her trademark, spending hours studying wind patterns, measuring distances, and calculating the thousands of variables that would influence her shot. The mountain environment was challenging. Temperature variations created thermal currents that could deflect a bullet by several inches, and the altitude affected both ballistic performance and her own physical capabilities. The first position, the rocky outcropping, offered the best concealment but suffered from inconsistent wind patterns caused by the surrounding terrain. Gusts would sweep up from the valley without warning, creating conditions that could prove fatal to long-range accuracy. She ruled it out after 18 hours of observation, despite its other advantages. The forested ridge provided better environmental stability, but presented logistical challenges. The approach required a 6-kilometer hike through terrain that showed signs of recent human activity, probably hunters or hikers who could compromise operational security. More concerning was the lack of covered escape routes if the mission went wrong, and local security forces responded faster than anticipated. The ruins of the abandoned village proved to be her best option, despite requiring the closest approach to the target. The destroyed buildings provided excellent concealment for her firing position, while offering multiple routes for infiltration and exfiltration. The range was well within her capabilities, and the elevation difference between her position and the target terrace would allow her to shoot slightly downhill, reducing the effects of wind and gravity on her bullet's trajectory. On the morning of the fourth day, Kieran established her final firing position among the ruins of what had once been a schoolhouse. The concrete walls, pitted with bullet holes and shrapnel damage from the war, provided solid support for her rifle while concealing her from observation. She had arrived 3 hours before dawn, moving through the darkness with the careful precision that characterized all her operations. Her M2010 rifle was perfectly zeroed, each component adjusted to account for local atmospheric conditions. The Schmidt and Bender scope had been calibrated using laser range-finding equipment, ensuring that her point of aim would align perfectly with her point of impact at the target distance. Match-grade ammunition sat in carefully organized rows beside her shooting position, each cartridge inspected for defects that could affect accuracy. "Ghost, this is Reaper. Radio check over." Castellanos' voice was barely audible through her earpiece, the encrypted communication system ensuring that their conversations remained secure from interception. "Reaper, this is Ghost. Lima Charlie, over." Her response confirmed that she could hear him loud and clear while maintaining the professional terminology that kept radio communications brief and secure. Weather update: winds light and variable less than 5 knots. Visibility unlimited, temperature 4 degrees Celsius. Target routine unchanged. Expected appearance on terrace at 0830 hours. Kieran glanced at her watch. 0815 hours. 15 minutes until the engagement window opened, assuming Petrov maintained his established pattern. She controlled her breathing, settling into the meditative state that allowed her to function at peak performance. Every muscle relaxed, every sense sharpened, every distraction eliminated from her consciousness. The terrace where Petrov would appear was clearly visible through her scope, magnified to the point where she could read the morning newspaper that someone had left on a small table. The distance was exactly 1,634 meters according to her laser rangefinder, well within the capabilities of her equipment and training. Wind conditions were nearly perfect, with only slight thermal currents rising from the valley floor as the sun warmed the landscape. "Ghost, this is Cypher. Target is moving, approaching the terrace now." Kieran's breathing slowed automatically, her heart rate dropping as her body entered the physiological state that preceded perfect marksmanship. Through her scope, she could see movement inside the compound's main building, shadows passing behind windows as the target's morning routine played out according to established patterns. At exactly 0830 hours, Viktor Petrov stepped onto the terrace. He was a smaller man than his photograph suggested, wearing a dark business suit despite the early hour and mountainous location. His movements were confident, relaxed, those of someone who believed himself safe within his fortress. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and what appeared to be a secure satellite phone, probably preparing for the sensitive conversations that Vasquez had identified during her intelligence collection. Kieran centered her crosshairs on the target's torso, the largest and most stable aiming point available. Her breathing became shallow, controlled, each exhalation bringing her closer to the perfect moment when all variables aligned for the shot that would end Viktor Petrov's criminal empire. The distance was significant but manageable, the weather conditions nearly ideal, the target clearly visible and unaware of the danger that watched him through a high-powered scope. But as her finger took up slack in the trigger, something made her pause. Years of training and experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about this situation felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, but incomplete wrong, as if critical information was missing from the tactical equation. Cipher, this is Ghost. Can you confirm target identity? I need positive visual confirmation before engagement. Through her scope, she watched Petrov settle into a chair facing the valley, raising his coffee cup in what appeared to be a casual gesture. But trained eyes noticed details that civilian observers might miss. The way he held his left shoulder suggested an old injury, probably military-related. His posture indicated someone comfortable with violence, alert to his surroundings despite the relaxed setting. Ghost, this is Cipher. Facial recognition confirms target identity with 97% probability. You are cleared to engage. Kieran's finger returned to the trigger, but the nagging sense of incompleteness persisted. Something was missing from this picture, some element that her subconscious had identified but her conscious mind hadn't yet processed. She had learned to trust these instincts. They had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments and countless missions, where the difference between success and failure measured in fractions of seconds. Then she saw it. A child's bicycle leaning against the terrace railing, small and brightly colored, definitely not part of the compound's defensive preparations, which meant there were civilians in the building, probably family members who would become collateral damage if the mission went wrong, and security forces responded with typical Balkan ruthlessness. Reaper, this is Ghost. I need confirmation on civilian presence in target area. Observed possible indicators of children on premises. The radio remained silent for several seconds, long enough for Kieran to maintain her sight picture while waiting for intelligence update. Through her scope, she watched Petrov answer his satellite phone, beginning what appeared to be an animated conversation in a language she didn't recognize. His body language suggested business negotiations, probably the kind of deals that supplied weapons to organizations that specialized in killing innocent people. Ghost, this is Reaper. Intelligence indicates possible family members on premises, but mission parameters unchanged. You are authorized to engage at your discretion. Kieran's training was clear. Mission accomplishment took precedence over all other considerations, including potential civilian casualties. But her personal code was equally clear. Innocent lives were never acceptable losses, regardless of mission importance. The tension between these two imperatives had defined her entire military career, forcing her to make decisions that would haunt her long after the shooting stopped. Through her scope, she watched Viktor Petrov end his phone conversation and stand to stretch, his movement casual and unhurried. He was perhaps 30 seconds away from stepping back inside the building, ending the engagement opportunity and forcing Task Force Phantom to wait for another chance. The perfect shot was available, clear sight picture, optimal weather conditions, target unaware and exposed. But the child's bicycle remained visible in her peripheral vision, a splash of innocent color in a world defined by violence and consequences. Somewhere in that building, a child was probably eating breakfast, completely unaware that their presence had just saved their grandfather from a bullet fired from over a mile away. Kieran's finger moved away from the trigger. Reaper, this is Ghost. Mission abort. Civilian presence confirmed, unacceptable risk of collateral damage. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to stretch for eternity, though her chronometer indicated only 15 seconds had elapsed. She maintained her sight picture, watching Petrov finish his coffee and prepare to return indoors. The target would survive this morning, but his reprieve came at the cost of mission failure and potential consequences for other innocent lives throughout Europe. Ghost, this is Reaper. Confirm mission abort. Exfiltrate to Rally Point Alpha. We'll reassess and develop alternative approaches. As Kieran began breaking down her rifle system and preparing for extraction, she felt the familiar mixture of frustration and relief that followed difficult decisions. The perfect shot had been available, but perfection in marksmanship meant nothing if it came at the cost of moral compromise. Some targets weren't worth the price they demanded, and some victories weren't worth achieving if they required sacrificing the principles that separated soldiers from murderers. The abandoned village remained silent around her as she packed her equipment and prepared to move. But in her mind, she could still see that child's bicycle, bright and innocent against the backdrop of adult violence, a reminder that even in the world of special operations, some lines should never be crossed. The safe house felt different when Task Force Phantom returned from the aborted mission. The air carried a tension that hadn't existed before, the kind of strain that developed when professional soldiers were forced to confront the gap between military objectives and moral imperatives. Kieran sat at the kitchen table, methodically cleaning her rifle, while the rest of the team processed what had happened on the mountain above Pale. Lieutenant Commander Castellano stood at the window overlooking the valley, his posture rigid with the frustration of a career special operations officer who had never failed to complete a mission. Captain Vasquez monitored her communication equipment with unusual intensity, as if the electronics could provide answers to questions that had nothing to do with intelligence or technology. Master Sergeant Washington occupied a corner of the room, his massive frame somehow managing to look smaller as he contemplated the implications of their situation. The child's bicycle wasn't in any of our surveillance photos, Vasquez said finally, breaking the silence that had dominated their return journey. Intelligence indicated possible family presence, but nothing definitive about children actually being on the premises during engagement windows. Kieran looked up from her rifle maintenance, meeting each team member's eyes in turn. The bicycle was there. Bright yellow, training wheels, probably belongs to someone between 5 and 8 years old. Maybe I should have taken the shot anyway, but I couldn't risk it. You made the right call, Ghost. Washington's voice carried the authority of someone who had faced similar moral dilemmas in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mission success means nothing if we become the kind of people who sacrifice children for operational convenience. That's what separates us from the targets we're hunting. Castellanos turned from the window, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. The question now is how we proceed. Petrov isn't going to maintain the same routine indefinitely, and intelligence suggests he's planning to relocate his operations within the next 2 weeks. If we're going to complete this mission, we need to develop alternative approaches. The satellite imagery that had dominated their initial planning session appeared on Vasquez's monitors, but now the compound looked different to Kieran. Instead of seeing only fields of fire and engagement angles, she found herself wondering about the people who lived behind those walls. The intelligence briefings had focused exclusively on Viktor Petrov and his criminal activities, treating everyone else in the compound as either security threats or acceptable collateral damage. What do we actually know about his family? Kieran asked. Wife, children, their daily routines. Maybe there's a way to separate the target from innocent bystanders without compromising mission effectiveness. Vasquez's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing databases that painted a more complete picture of their target's personal life. Wife deceased 3 years ago, cancer. One daughter married and living in Belgrade. One son divorced, works in the family business. But there are grandchildren. Daughter's 2 kids visit frequently, ages 6 and 9. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The child's bicycle belonged to one of Petrov's grandchildren, innocent victims of their grandfather's choices, who had no understanding of the violence that surrounded their family. Intelligence had identified their presence as a possibility, but hadn't considered the moral implications of conducting lethal operations in their vicinity. "So we wait," Kieran said simply. "We establish surveillance, identify patterns, and wait for an opportunity when civilians aren't present. Good sniping has always been about patience." "Time is a factor," Castellanos reminded them. "Every day Petrov remains operational. Weapons flow to terrorist organizations throughout Europe. Intelligence indicates he's planning something significant, possibly a major shipment to cells in France and Germany. If we don't act soon, innocent people are going to die." The moral calculus of special operations had always been complex, weighing immediate ethical concerns against broader strategic imperatives. Kieran understood that her refusal to take the shot might indirectly contribute to future terrorist attacks, but she also knew that compromising fundamental principles was a line from which there was no return. "Then we find another way," she said with quiet determination. "Maybe the answer isn't a long-range shot. Maybe we need to get closer." Washington raised an eyebrow. "You talking about close-quarters work? That's not exactly your specialty, Ghost." "No, but it is yours. And Reaper's. What if we create a situation that forces Petrov to expose himself without his family present? Draw him away from the compound. Give me a clear shot without risking civilian casualties." Castellanos moved to the table, spreading out detailed maps of the surrounding area. "What do you have in mind?" Kieran studied the topography, looking for locations where their target might be vulnerable but separated from his protective environment. "He's a businessman, right? Deals with suppliers, customers, financial arrangements that require face-to-face meetings. What if one of those meetings was engineered by us?" "You're talking about a deception operation," Vasquez said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Create a false business opportunity, lure him to a location where Ghost can establish overwatch, eliminate the target in a controlled environment." "Exactly. But it has to be believable, something that fits his established patterns and business interests. And the location has to provide the tactical advantages we need while ensuring civilian safety." The next 6 hours were devoted to developing what Castellanos designated Operation Lure. Vasquez created a fictitious arms dealer from Montenegro, complete with encrypted communications, financial records, and intelligence intercepts that would withstand casual scrutiny. The imaginary businessman claimed to have access to advanced anti-aircraft systems recently liberated from Ukrainian military stocks, precisely the kind of high-value weaponry that would interest someone with Petrov's client base. The meeting location was carefully selected, an abandoned monastery 15 kilometers northeast of Pale, situated on a hilltop that provided excellent sight lines, while ensuring that any security presence could be observed and neutralized if necessary. The ruins were sufficiently isolated to prevent civilian casualties, while offering multiple approach and escape routes for both the target and Task Force Phantom. "Initial contact will be through encrypted channels that Petrov's organization regularly monitors," Vasquez explained, showing the team her carefully crafted deception. "Our fictitious dealer claims to have samples available for inspection, but insists on a secure meeting location due to the sensitive nature of the merchandise." Kieran studied satellite imagery of the monastery ruins, calculating engagement angles and distances with professional precision. The bell tower offered an ideal firing position at approximately 800 meters from where the meeting would take place, close enough to ensure accuracy while providing excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. Weather patterns in that area, she asked. More consistent than the previous location, Vasquez replied. Valley winds are predictable, temperature variations minimal during morning hours. Optimal engagement window would be between 0900 and 1100 hours. Security considerations. The monastery has been abandoned since the war. No civilian activity in the immediate area. Local police rarely patrol that sector, and the nearest military unit is over 50 kilometers away. Response time for hostile forces would be at least 30 minutes, giving us adequate time for exfiltration, even if the operation is compromised. Castellanos reviewed the operational plan with the methodical attention to detail that had kept him alive through dozens of similar missions. Timeline for implementation. 48 hours to establish credibility for our fictitious dealer, another 24 to arrange the meeting, Vasquez calculated. Petrov's organization will want to verify our credentials before committing to a face-to-face encounter, especially given the value of the supposed merchandise. The deception began that evening, with Vasquez initiating contact through encrypted channels that intelligence had identified as part of Petrov's communication network. Her fictitious arms dealer, operating under the name Dmitry Kovac, claimed to represent Serbian military officers willing to sell advanced weaponry acquired during NATO training exercises. The story was plausible enough to generate interest, while exotic enough to justify unusual security precautions. Kieran spent the waiting period conducting detailed reconnaissance of the monastery ruins, approaching from different directions to understand the tactical environment from every possible angle. The medieval structure had been built on elevated ground, its stone walls thick enough to stop small arms fire, while providing excellent observation points overlooking the surrounding countryside. The bell tower stood 4 stories above the main courtyard, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of mountain weather, but structurally sound enough to support a sniper's equipment. Arrow slits, originally designed for medieval archers, provided perfect firing ports, concealing a modern marksman while allowing engagement of targets in the courtyard below. The positioning was so ideal that Kieran wondered if the monastery's builders had been thinking about defensive considerations that transcended their historical period. Ghost, this is Cypher. Initial contact successful. Target organization is interested but requesting additional verification of merchandise authenticity. Vasquez's voice carried satisfaction mixed with professional caution. They're being careful, which suggests they've been burned by false opportunities before. How long for verification process? Kieran asked, maintaining radio discipline while surveying potential approach routes to her firing position. Estimated 36 to 48 hours. They'll want to check our fictional dealer's credentials against their own intelligence sources, probably contact associates in Serbia to verify the story. If our deception holds up to scrutiny, they'll propose a meeting location and security arrangements. The psychological aspects of the operation were as important as the tactical elements. Petrov had survived in the arms trade by being paranoid and methodical, never taking unnecessary risks or trusting unverified sources. Convincing him to leave his fortress and meet with strangers would require a carefully crafted appeal to both his greed and his professional instincts. Vasquez had constructed their fictional opportunity around advanced surface-to-air missile systems, specifically 9 K-338 Igla-S variants, that would appeal to terrorist organizations seeking to threaten civilian aviation. The weapons were valuable enough to justify personal attention from someone at Petrov's level, while being rare enough to explain why the transaction couldn't be conducted through normal channels. The key, Castellanos explained during their evening briefing, is making him believe that this opportunity is both legitimate and time-sensitive. Our dealer claims the Serbian officers are under investigation, and need to move the merchandise quickly before military security discovers the theft. Kieran nodded, understanding the psychological manipulation involved. Creates urgency without appearing desperate. Professional criminals respect other professionals, especially military personnel willing to risk their careers for profit. Exactly. And the monetary amounts involved are significant enough to warrant personal attention, but not so large as to suggest a setup. Intelligence indicates Petrov typically handles transactions in the $5 to $10 million range personally. The waiting was always the most difficult part of special operations. Once the action began, training and experience took over, but the anticipatory period required mental discipline that could be more challenging than physical danger. Kieran spent the time maintaining her equipment, studying meteorological data, and running through mental rehearsals of the upcoming engagement. Every successful sniper developed personal rituals that helped maintain psychological equilibrium during high-stress operations. For Kieran, this meant methodical equipment checks, detailed study of ballistic calculations, and visualization exercises that mentally rehearsed every aspect of the upcoming shot. She would imagine the sight picture, the trigger squeeze, the bullet's flight path, and the target's reaction, playing out scenarios until her responses became automatic. On the second morning, Vasquez received the communication they had been anticipating. Ghost, this is Cypher. Target has agreed to preliminary meeting. Location to be determined by mutual agreement. Security limited to 4 personnel per side. Inspection of merchandise samples only. Proposed location, Kieran asked, though she suspected the answer would align with their operational planning. They're requesting somewhere between Pale and Sarajevo, isolated but accessible by vehicle. I'm going to suggest our monastery site, citing security concerns and the need for concealment from aerial surveillance. The negotiation process consumed another 8 hours, with both sides proposing modifications and security arrangements that created the appearance of legitimate business caution. Eventually, they agreed on the monastery ruins as the meeting location, scheduled for the following morning at 1000 hours. Each side would bring exactly 4 personnel, with weapons permitted but not displayed, and the meeting would last no more than 30 minutes. Kieran established her firing position in the monastery's bell tower 3 hours before the scheduled meeting, moving through pre-dawn darkness with equipment that had been carefully selected for the mission requirements. Her M2010 rifle was configured for the 800-meter engagement distance, with ballistic calculations adjusted for the specific atmospheric conditions forecast for the target area. The view from the bell tower was commanding, overlooking the entire monastery complex and the access road that led up from the valley floor. Ancient arrow slits provided perfect concealment while allowing complete observation of the courtyard where the meeting would take place. The positioning gave her multiple engagement angles and clear sight lines that would ensure target elimination regardless of where Petrov positioned himself during the transaction. Ghost, this is Reaper. Radio check over. Reaper, this is Ghost. Lima Charlie. Position established, site secure, ready for mission execution. Copy that. Cypher and Boulder are established in overwatch positions. Target convoy expected to arrive at 0945 hours based on travel time from compound. Kieran settled into her shooting position, checking her equipment one final time before beginning the patient observation that characterized professional marksmanship. The morning was clear and calm, with light winds that would have minimal effect on bullet trajectory. Temperature was steady at 8 degrees Celsius, well within the parameters she had used for ballistic calculations. At precisely 0945 hours, 2 black SUVs appeared on the access road leading to the monastery. Through her scope, Kieran could see 4 figures in the lead vehicle, with at least 3 more in the trailing SUV. The convoy moved cautiously, stopping twice to allow security personnel to dismount and check the roadway for potential threats. Cypher, this is Ghost. Target convoy in sight, approaching final approach to monastery. Confirm target identification when personnel dismount. Roger Ghost, monitoring all communications frequencies. No signs of counter-surveillance or hostile activity. The vehicles stopped in the monastery's main courtyard, positioning themselves to allow rapid departure if the situation deteriorated. The doors opened simultaneously, disgorging security personnel who immediately established a defensive perimeter around the lead SUV. Their movements were professional and coordinated, suggesting military or law enforcement background. Viktor Petrov emerged from the rear seat of the lead vehicle, appearing exactly as he had in the intelligence photographs, but somehow smaller in person. He wore a dark overcoat against the mountain chill and moved with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous environments. 3 bodyguards remained close to his position, while the 4th maintained overwatch from beside the vehicles. Ghost, this is Cypher. Positive identification confirmed. You are cleared to engage at your discretion. Through her scope, Kieran watched Petrov survey the monastery ruins with obvious caution, his eyes scanning the bell tower and other elevated positions that could conceal threats. His bodyguards were equally alert, their positioning designed to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining protection for their principal. These were professionals who understood the vulnerabilities inherent in exposed meetings. But they were also focused on ground-level threats, operating under the reasonable assumption that any attack would come from concealed positions at their own elevation. The possibility of sniper fire from the bell tower had apparently been considered and dismissed, probably because the distance seemed too great for accurate shooting under field conditions. Kieran's crosshairs settled on Petrov's center mass, the largest and most stable target area available. Her breathing slowed automatically, her heart rate dropping as years of training took control of her physiological responses. The range was 847 meters according to her laser measurement, well within her capabilities under current weather conditions. Target acquired, she whispered into her radio. Stand by for engagement. Petrov checked his watch and looked toward the monastery entrance, obviously expecting the arrival of their fictitious arms dealer. His bodyguards maintained their defensive positions, but showed no signs of suspecting deception. The entire scene had the appearance of a routine business meeting between criminal organizations, exactly what Vasquez's careful planning had intended to create. Kieran's finger took up slack in her trigger, applying the precise pressure that would send a 300-grain bullet across 847 meters of mountain air to end Viktor Petrov's criminal career. Every variable had been calculated, every contingency planned, every aspect of the mission rehearsed until execution became automatic. But as she prepared to fire, movement in her peripheral vision caused her to pause. A small figure had appeared at the edge of the monastery complex. A child, perhaps 10 years old, obviously local and probably exploring the ruins with the casual curiosity that characterized young people everywhere. The child was well outside the immediate engagement area, but close enough to potentially be affected if the situation deteriorated into a firefight. Cypher, this is Ghost. Hold engagement. Civilian child present in target area. Through her scope, she watched Petrov's head turn toward the unexpected arrival, his expression shifting from professional caution to genuine concern. He spoke rapidly to his bodyguards, pointing toward the child and issuing what appeared to be instructions for ensuring the young person's safety. His reaction revealed something that intelligence files had missed. Despite his criminal activities, Viktor Petrov retained enough humanity to worry about innocent bystanders. Ghost, this is Reaper. Confirm status. Do you have a clear shot? Kieran maintained her sight picture while tracking the child's movement through the ruins. The young person was moving away from the meeting area, apparently unaware of the drama unfolding in the courtyard below. Within moments, the child would be safely outside any potential danger zone, leaving Petrov exposed and vulnerable to long-range engagement. Stand by, Reaper. Civilian moving clear of engagement area. But watching Petrov's reaction to the child's presence had introduced an element of moral complexity that hadn't existed during mission planning. The arms dealer's immediate concern for an unknown child's safety suggested a character more nuanced than the intelligence briefings had indicated. He was still a criminal whose activities contributed to violence throughout Europe, but he was also a grandfather who worried about children in dangerous situations. The child disappeared behind a section of ruined wall, finally moving outside the potential engagement zone. Petrov turned his attention back to the expected meeting, checking his watch again with growing impatience. His bodyguards remained alert, but showed no signs of suspecting that death was watching them through a high-powered scope from the monastery's bell tower. Kieran reacquired her sight picture, centering the crosshairs on Petrov's torso with mechanical precision. The shot was available, the conditions optimal, the target unaware and exposed. Everything aligned for mission success, except the nagging doubt that had been planted by witnessing a moment of basic human decency from someone she had been trained to view as simply another target. Ghost, this is Reaper. Status report. Her finger returned to the trigger, taking up slack with the muscle memory developed through thousands of training repetitions. Viktor Petrov would die in the next few seconds, his criminal empire would collapse, and weapons shipments to terrorist organizations would be disrupted throughout Europe. The mission would be a success by any measurable standard. But success in special operations wasn't always measured by mission accomplishment alone. Sometimes it was measured by the preservation of principles that separated soldiers from assassins, professionals from killers, those who served justice from those who simply served power. The decision that Kieran faced in that moment transcended tactical considerations and entered the realm of moral philosophy. Through her scope, she watched Viktor Petrov check his watch one final time before apparently deciding that their fictitious arms dealer was not going to appear. He gestured to his bodyguards, indicating that it was time to leave, and began walking back toward the vehicles that would carry him away from the monastery and back to his fortress above Pale. The engagement window was closing. Within seconds, Petrov would be inside his armored SUV and beyond reach of long-range fire. The perfect shot was available for perhaps 10 more seconds, after which Task Force Phantom would face the prospect of mission failure and the political consequences that would inevitably follow. Kieran's finger tightened on the trigger, applying the final pressure that would complete her mission and eliminate a significant threat to European security. The bullet would take approximately 1.2 seconds to cross the distance to its target, traveling at just over 800 meters per second through mountain air that would barely affect its trajectory. But in that final moment before firing, she found herself thinking not about ballistic calculations or mission parameters, but about the child who had wandered through the ruins and the grandfather who had shown concern for an unknown young person's safety. The world was complex in ways that intelligence briefings could never fully capture, filled with people who were simultaneously heroes and villains, threats and protectors, enemies and fathers. Her finger moved away from the trigger. Reaper, this is Ghost. Mission abort. Target entering vehicle, engagement window closed. The radio remained silent for several seconds before Castellanos responded. Copy, Ghost. Exfiltrate to Rally Point Alpha. We'll reassess and develop alternative approaches. As Kieran began breaking down her rifle system and preparing for extraction, she watched the two SUVs disappear down the mountain road, carrying Viktor Petrov back to his compound. The mission had failed by conventional standards, but something more important had been preserved. The principle that killing should never become routine, never become easy, never become divorced from the moral complexity that separated professional soldiers from common murderers. The abandoned monastery fell silent around her as she packed her equipment and prepared to leave. But the memory of that moment, watching a criminal show concern for an innocent child, would remain with her long after the operational details faded. In a world where violence was often the simplest solution, choosing restraint required a different kind of courage, one that couldn't be taught in sniper schools or special operations training programs. The safe house felt like a tribunal when Task Force Phantom reassembled that evening. The weight of two mission failures hung over the team like mountain fog, thick and persistent, and impossible to ignore. Kieran sat across from Lieutenant Commander Castellanos, who was studying after-action reports with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation that kept producing the wrong answer. Captain Vasquez monitored her communication equipment with unusual intensity, as if the electronic intelligence flowing across her screens could provide insight into decisions that had nothing to do with technology or tradecraft. Master Sergeant Washington occupied his usual corner, his massive frame somehow conveying both support and disappointment in equal measure. "Two opportunities, two aborts," Castellanos said finally, his voice carrying the professional neutrality that special operations officers used when discussing failures that could have strategic consequences. "I need to understand your decision-making process, Ghost. These weren't marginal situations with unclear target identification. These were textbook engagements against a legitimate high-value target." Kieran met his gaze directly, recognizing that her career could be decided by the next few minutes of conversation. "Both situations involved potential civilian casualties, sir. The first had confirmed children present. The second had an unknown child in the engagement area. I couldn't guarantee zero collateral damage." The mission parameters clearly state that acceptable risk levels include potential civilian casualties when weighed against strategic objectives, Castellanos replied. "Petrov's organization is responsible for weapons shipments that have killed hundreds of innocent people throughout Europe. His elimination could prevent thousands of future deaths." "I understand the strategic calculus, sir. But I also understand that the moment we start accepting civilian casualties for operational convenience, we become something different from what we're supposed to be." Washington leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced similar moral dilemmas on multiple continents. "Ghost's got a point, Reaper. The rules of engagement exist for a reason, and part of being professional soldiers is knowing when not to pull the trigger. Sometimes mission failure is preferable to mission success at the wrong price." Vasquez looked up from her monitors, adding her perspective to the discussion. "Intelligence indicates Petrov is planning to relocate his operations within the next week. If we don't act soon, we'll lose our window of opportunity entirely. His new base of operations is reportedly in Montenegro, where our jurisdiction is even more limited." The tactical situation was deteriorating while they debated operational ethics. Every day that passed gave their target additional opportunities to complete whatever major weapons shipment intelligence had detected, potentially placing advanced weaponry in the hands of terrorist organizations throughout Europe. The pressure to complete the mission was real and justified by legitimate security concerns. But Kieran had learned during 3 combat deployments that maintaining moral principles under pressure was precisely when those principles mattered most. Anyone could make ethical decisions when the stakes were low and the consequences manageable. True character was revealed when doing the right thing came at significant personal and professional cost. "What if we change the approach entirely?" she suggested, studying the satellite imagery that still covered Vasquez's workstation. "Instead of trying to eliminate Petrov, what if we focused on disrupting his operations? Destroy the weapons shipments, compromise his financial networks, neutralize his organization without necessarily killing him." Castellanos considered this suggestion with the methodical attention he applied to all tactical problems. The mission parameters specifically call for elimination of the target. Weapons shipments can be replaced, financial networks can be reconstituted, organizations can adapt and survive. But leadership elimination creates permanent disruption that's much harder to overcome. Unless the leadership is replaced by someone more dangerous, Kieran countered. Intelligence files indicate Petrov's son is more ruthless and less cautious than his father. Eliminating the current target might actually make the situation worse in the long term. The complexity of their situation was becoming apparent to everyone in the room. Military operations typically focused on immediate tactical objectives, without considering second and third-order effects that could extend far beyond the initial mission. But special operations in the modern world required thinking that transcended simple target elimination and considered broader strategic implications. Vasquez's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing intelligence databases that painted a more complete picture of the Petrov organization's structure and succession plans. Ghost might be right about the son. Milan Petrov has been linked to operations in Syria and Iraq, specifically weapons shipments to groups that target civilian populations. His methods are reportedly much more extreme than his father's. So we're potentially looking at a situation where mission success could make the overall problem worse, Washington observed. That's the kind of strategic thinking that doesn't get taught in special operations schools. Castellano stood and moved to the window overlooking the valley, his posture suggesting someone wrestling with decisions that had implications far beyond immediate tactical concerns. The mission came from the highest levels of NATO intelligence, based on assessment that Viktor Petrov represents a clear and present danger to European security. Those assessments are made by people with access to information we don't have. But they're also made by people who don't have to look through a rifle scope at a grandfather worried about a child's safety, Kieran replied quietly. Intelligence assessments can't capture every aspect of human complexity. Sometimes the person pulling the trigger has to make decisions based on information that doesn't appear in any briefing file. The philosophical implications of their discussion extended far beyond the immediate operational situation. Every special operations mission raised questions about the relationship between individual moral responsibility and institutional authority, between following orders and following conscience, between tactical success and strategic wisdom. These were the questions that kept professional soldiers awake at night, wondering whether the actions they had taken in service of their country had actually made the world safer or simply redistributed violence in ways that couldn't be measured by mission success metrics. They were also the questions that separated true professionals from those who simply followed orders without considering consequences. There's another consideration, Vasquez said, interrupting the philosophical discussion with practical intelligence. Communications intercepts suggest that Petrov's organization is aware they're under some form of surveillance. They've changed communication protocols, modified security procedures, and increased counterintelligence activities. Our window for any kind of operation is closing rapidly. Meaning what? Kieran asked. Meaning that if we don't act within the next 48 hours, they'll probably relocate to a position where we can't reach them at all. The Montenegro facility is reported to be a hardened bunker complex that would require a major military operation to penetrate. The tactical situation was forcing decisions that ideally would be made with more time for consideration and planning. But special operations typically occurred under exactly these kinds of time constraints, where perfect information was unavailable and moral clarity was complicated by operational pressures. Castellanos returned to the table, his expression suggesting that he had reached some kind of decision. Ghost, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to complete this mission, but I'm also going to modify the parameters based on your concerns about civilian casualties. How so, sir? We're going to create a situation where Petrov is isolated from his family and security personnel, where civilian casualties are impossible and collateral damage is minimized. If you can't take the shot under those conditions, then we'll reassess our entire approach to this target. Kieran nodded slowly, recognizing that this was probably her last chance to prove that ethical considerations and mission accomplishment could coexist. What did you have in mind? Intelligence indicates that Petrov makes a monthly trip to Sarajevo for medical treatment, dialysis, specifically. He travels with minimal security, uses a specific clinic, and follows a predictable route. The treatment takes approximately 4 hours, during which he's isolated and vulnerable. Vasquez pulled up street maps of Sarajevo, showing the route between Petrov's compound and the medical facility. The clinic is in a commercial district, but there are several elevated positions that would provide clear sight lines. Range would be between 400 and 600 meters, well within engagement parameters. Civilian density, Kieran asked, studying the urban environment with professional concern. Medical district, so foot traffic is predictable and manageable. We could time the engagement for when civilian presence is minimal, early morning before business hours or late evening after most facilities close. The proposal addressed most of Kieran's ethical concerns while maintaining the tactical viability necessary for mission success. The target would be isolated from family members. Civilian casualties could be minimized through careful timing, and the medical setting seemed somehow more appropriate for ending a life than the family compound where children played. But something about the scenario still troubled her, though she couldn't immediately identify what was causing her unease. Perhaps it was the clinical nature of targeting someone during medical treatment, or perhaps it was the growing realization that no amount of tactical modification could eliminate the fundamental moral complexity of killing another human being. "When is his next appointment?" she asked. 3 days from now, Thursday morning at 0800 hours, Vasquez replied. Intelligence confirms the appointment through medical facility communications intercepts. Security arrangements. Minimal, usually just his driver and one bodyguard. The medical facility has its own security, but they're focused on protecting patients and equipment, not defending against external threats. Petrov apparently believes that his medical needs don't pose security risks. Castellanos spread out detailed plans of the medical district, showing building heights, sight lines, and potential firing positions. There's a construction site approximately 500 meters from the clinic entrance, 12-story building under renovation. Perfect elevation, clear sight lines, multiple escape routes. Kieran studied the tactical situation with the methodical analysis that had characterized her entire military career. The positioning was ideal for long-range engagement, the civilian risk was manageable, and the target would be isolated from family members who had complicated her previous decisions. Every technical aspect of the mission favored success. But as she visualized the engagement, she found herself thinking about the human dimensions that never appeared in tactical planning. Somewhere in Sarajevo, Viktor Petrov was probably worried about his health, concerned about medical procedures that reminded him of his mortality. His family was probably worried about him, hoping that treatment would extend his life despite the diseases that required regular dialysis. These were the same fundamental human experiences that connected all people regardless of their political affiliations or criminal activities. Fear of death, concern for family, hope for the future, emotions that transcended the categories of enemy and ally that defined military operations. "I'll need detailed medical facility layouts, security camera positions, and civilian traffic patterns for the entire district," Kieran said finally. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it professionally, with zero risk to innocent people." "Understood. Cypher will provide complete intelligence packages within 24 hours. As the team dispersed to begin mission preparation, Kieran remained at the table studying the maps and satellite imagery that would define her next few days. The decision to accept this final mission represented more than professional duty. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes serving the greater good required accepting moral complexity that could never be fully resolved. The construction site in Sarajevo reminded Kieran of a dozen similar locations where she had established firing positions during her deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Concrete and steel frameworks rose toward the sky like the skeleton of some massive creature, their unfinished surfaces providing both concealment and structural support for precision shooting equipment. She had arrived before dawn, moving through the empty streets of Sarajevo with equipment bags that could have belonged to any construction worker reporting for an early shift. The security guard at the site entrance was more interested in his coffee and morning newspaper than in checking credentials for someone who looked like they belonged in a hard hat and work boots. The 11th floor provided the optimal firing position, high enough to clear intervening buildings but not so elevated as to create difficult shooting angles. Through the unfinished windows, she had clear sight lines to the medical clinic, where Viktor Petrov would arrive in approximately 90 minutes for his scheduled dialysis treatment. Her M2010 rifle was perfectly configured for the 487-meter engagement distance, with atmospheric conditions that favored accuracy and precision. The morning air was calm and clear, with minimal wind that would have negligible effect on bullet trajectory. Temperature was steady at 12 degrees Celsius, well within the parameters she had used for ballistic calculations. Ghost, this is Reaper. Radio check over. Reaper, this is Ghost. Lima Charlie. Position established, site secure, ready for mission execution. Copy that. Cipher confirms target departed compound 30 minutes ago. Estimated arrival at medical facility in 60 minutes. Boulder is established in overwatch position, ready to provide security during exfiltration. Kieran settled into her shooting position, using concrete blocks and construction materials to create a stable platform for her rifle. The urban environment required different considerations than mountain shooting. Building materials could deflect bullets unpredictably, glass windows could affect trajectory, and the dense civilian population meant that every shot had to be absolutely precise. Through her scope, she could see the medical clinic's entrance clearly, along with the parking area where Petrov's vehicle would arrive. The building was modern and well-maintained, serving patients throughout Sarajevo who required specialized treatments. It was the kind of place where people came seeking healing, not the kind of place where death typically arrived through a rifle scope. Cipher, this is Ghost. Confirm civilian activity in target area. Ghost, this is Cipher. Medical facility operating normally, estimated 15 to 20 patients and staff present. Street traffic light, consistent with early morning patterns in commercial districts. The moral weight of the situation pressed down on Kieran like physical force. Somewhere below her, people were receiving medical treatment that might extend their lives. Families were hopping for good news from doctors, and medical professionals were working to heal rather than harm. Into this environment of hope and healing, she was preparing to introduce violence and death. But she also understood that Viktor Petrov's continued existence represented a different kind of threat to innocent lives throughout Europe. His weapons shipments enabled terrorist organizations that specifically targeted civilian populations, creating fear and suffering that extended far beyond any individual medical facility. The moral calculus was complex, but it ultimately favored action over inaction. At precisely 07:55 hours, a black Mercedes sedan appeared on the street leading to the medical clinic. Through her scope, Kieran could see two figures in the front seats, the driver and a bodyguard, with a single passenger in the rear. The vehicle moved slowly, its occupants obviously scanning for potential threats in the surrounding area. Cipher, this is Ghost. Target vehicle in sight, approaching medical facility. Roger, Ghost. Confirm target identification when passenger exits vehicle. The Mercedes stopped directly in front of the clinic entrance, positioning itself to allow rapid departure if necessary. The passenger door opened, and Viktor Petrov emerged slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose health required constant attention to physical limitations. He appeared smaller and more fragile than in his intelligence photographs, wearing a dark overcoat and walking with a slight limp that suggested ongoing medical issues. His bodyguard remained close but not obviously protective, creating the appearance of a routine medical appointment rather than a security operation. Ghost, this is Cypher. Positive target identification confirmed. You are cleared to engage. Through her scope, Kieran watched Petrov pause at the clinic entrance, speaking briefly with his bodyguard before disappearing inside the building. The engagement window was closing. Once inside, he would be surrounded by innocent patients and medical staff, making precision shooting impossible without risking civilian casualties. Her crosshairs settled on the clinic entrance, where Petrov would reappear in approximately 4 hours when his treatment was complete. The waiting was always the most difficult part of sniping, requiring mental discipline that could be more challenging than the actual shooting. But this waiting felt different, heavier, more morally complex, charged with implications that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Reaper, this is Ghost. Target has entered medical facility, beginning overwatch. Estimated engagement window in 4 hours. Copy Ghost. Maintain position and await target emergence. Weather conditions remain favorable for engagement. The hours passed slowly, marked by the gradual increase in civilian activity as Sarajevo came alive with morning business. Through her scope, Kieran watched patients arrive for medical appointments, families gathering in waiting areas, medical staff beginning their daily routines of caring for the sick and injured. The contrast between her mission and the surrounding environment was stark and unsettling. While she prepared to end a life, everyone else in her field of view was focused on preserving life, healing injury, and maintaining hope in the face of illness and disease. The juxtaposition forced her to confront questions about the nature of her profession and its place in a world that valued healing over violence. At 11:45 hours, movement inside the clinic suggested that treatments were concluding and patients were preparing to leave. Through the windows, Kieran could see figures moving in what appeared to be the reception area, probably patients checking out and scheduling follow-up appointments. Cypher, this is Ghost. Activity observed inside medical facility. Possible preparation for target departure. Roger, Ghost. Communications intercepts confirm treatment completion. Target expected to emerge within 15 minutes. Kieran's breathing slowed automatically, her body entering the physiological state that preceded precision shooting. Every muscle relaxed, every sense sharpened, every distraction eliminated from her consciousness. The world narrowed to the view through her rifle scope, where crosshairs waited to intersect with a target who remained unaware of the danger watching him from 487 meters away. At exactly 1200 hours, the clinic door opened and Viktor Petrov emerged into the midday sunlight. He moved more slowly than when he had arrived, suggesting that the medical treatment had left him weakened or disoriented. His bodyguard remained close, alert to the surrounding environment, but focused on ground-level threats rather than elevated firing positions. Kieran's crosshairs centered on Petrov's torso, the largest and most stable target area available. The range was well within her capabilities, weather conditions were optimal, and the target was clearly visible and unaware of danger. Every technical aspect of the engagement favored mission success. But as her finger took up slack in the trigger, she found herself studying Petrov's face through the high-powered scope. The man she saw was tired, probably in pain from his medical condition, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was failing despite the best efforts of modern medicine. He was simultaneously a grandfather worried about his family's safety and an arms dealer whose activities contributed to violence throughout Europe. Ghost, this is Reaper. You have a clear shot. Confirm engagement. Through her scope, she watched Petrov pause beside his vehicle, apparently taking a moment to rest before beginning the journey back to his mountain compound. His expression was thoughtful, perhaps contemplative, the look of someone reflecting on mortality in the way that serious illness forced people to confront their own limitations. Ghost, this is Reaper, confirm status. Kieran's finger remained on the trigger, applying pressure that would send a bullet across nearly 500 meters of urban airspace to end Viktor Petrov's life. The shot was available, the conditions were perfect, and the mission parameters clearly authorized lethal force against a legitimate target. But in that final moment, she found herself unable to complete the trigger squeeze that would transform her from a professional soldier into something else entirely. The man in her crosshairs was a criminal whose activities justified elimination under the rules of engagement, but he was also a human being whose death would create ripples of grief and consequence that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives. Her finger moved away from the trigger. Reaper, this is Ghost. Mission abort. Unable to engage due to technical difficulties with equipment. The lie came easily, providing a face-saving explanation that avoided the moral complexities that had actually prevented her from firing. But she knew that Castellanos would understand the real reason for her hesitation, just as she knew that this would probably be her last mission with Task Force Phantom. Copy Ghost. Exfiltrate to Rally Point Alpha. We'll reassess equipment status and develop alternative approaches. As Kieran began breaking down her rifle and preparing for extraction, she watched Viktor Petrov's Mercedes disappear into Sarajevo traffic, carrying its passenger back to his mountain fortress, where he would continue his criminal activities for at least another day. The mission had failed completely, and her military career would probably suffer consequences that could end her involvement in special operations entirely. But something more important had been preserved: the recognition that taking a human life should never become routine, never become easy, never become divorced from the moral complexity that separated professional soldiers from common killers. In a world where violence was often the simplest solution, choosing restraint required a different kind of courage, one that couldn't be taught in military schools or special operations training programs. The construction site remained quiet around her as she packed her equipment and prepared to leave Sarajevo forever. But the memory of those moments, watching a sick man contemplate his mortality outside a medical clinic, would remain with her long after the operational details faded, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories were measured not by missions accomplished, but by principles preserved.